everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's virtual New York Climate Week event, Growing Momentum for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I want to just invite everyone to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We have a really great group gathered today, and know more folks are going to be joining soon. So yeah, if you want to just share a bit about yourself in the chat, that'd be great to see who's here. You could add your name, your affiliation, and where you're joining from today. That'd be great. A few logistical notes before we get started. Just want to remind everyone to please keep your audio muted. I'm hearing a little background noise, so just a reminder, if you haven't already, to just hit mute, make sure that we can hear our panelists really well. You can post any questions at any time in the chat throughout the conversation. Today's event is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available on fossilfueltreaty.org after the event. If you have any technical questions, you can go ahead and send me an email at info@climateaccess.org. That's info@climateaccess.org. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator, Sephora Berman. Sephora is the International Program Director at Stand.Earth and the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. She's the co-founder of the Global Gas and Oil Network, former co-director of Greenpeace International's Global Climate and Energy Program, and recipient of the Climate Breakthrough Project Award. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sephora.
Thanks so much, Meredith, and welcome everybody. It's especially important, I think, that we're having this webinar today, because 2 years ago at Climate Week, we launched the Global Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And you know, it's a very big and bold initiative. And our goal was to build a network of support in diverse communities around the world. Because, you know, together we're so much greater than the sum of our parts. We wanted to make sure that we are jointly calling on governments to do something that is commensurate with the scale of the problem, that we make sure that we start to align fossil fuel production and stop the expansion of new projects in line with the science, in line with the Paris Agreement, and help us reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we also just really wanted to lift up this work and show decision makers that if they cooperate, if governments ensure that they cooperate together, that we can stop the expansion of fossil fuels and put all of our energy, all of our finances, all of our creativity toward building the world that we want. And so that was 24 months ago. And it is astonishing to me, the breadth of this work now around the world, how much traction we have. And so today we're going to explore some of that and explore some of the issues that are coming up along the way. And the next steps for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I'm Sephora Berman. I'm your host for the next hour. I normally am on the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, where I'm honored to live and work in Vancouver, Canada. But today I'm speaking to you from New York, from the territory of the Lenape Nations. So, as I mentioned, the campaign for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty was inspired in part by other treaties that address the threats of landmines, asbestos, and ozone depleting chemicals, and other dangerous threats. When we know that we have a problem, like oil, gas, and coal driving more than 85% of the carbon emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere, we know we have to stop making the threat bigger. Period. It's not a transition if we keep growing the problem. Over the past year, the campaign has been supported by 101 Nobel Laureates, including the Dalai Lama, 3,000 academics, 463 parliamentarians from 68 countries, thousands of prominent youth leaders, including Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakate, and hundreds of faith leaders, including this July, the Vatican, who endorsed the concept of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, as well as Islamic Relief Worldwide. 192 health leaders, including just this month, The World Health Organization endorsed the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and now more than 1,700 civil society organizations. So I'm really excited to introduce to you today our amazing panel to dive into a conversation about the Fossil Fuel Treaty and the ways that you can get involved with the growing movement. So let me give you a sense of who's joining us here. We have Dallas Goldtooth, who's the Indigenous Environment Network Media Team Lead, working with IEN staff and board and organizational partners from a diverse group of climate justice networks, along with his many tasks and duties with the IEN. He is also a Dakota cultural language teacher, nonviolent direct action trainer, and was one of the outstanding water protectors at Standing Rock, Osetai, I'm going to say this wrong, Dallas, Sakoan Camp, fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Also a very funny man and a very talented actor. We also have Bavreen Kandari, who is co-founder of the Warrior Moms Coalition in India, an initiative of environmentally conscious mothers fighting air pollution and children's right to breathe clean air. Bavreen studied communication to become a professional copywriter, but as a concerned citizen and parent, she was drawn to environmental action. We have Senator Carl Rhodes, who serves Hawaii's 13th district and is chair of the Committee on Judiciary and member of the Committees on Agriculture and Environmental Housing. Senator Rhodes is one of Hawaii's leading voices on climate change and legislative efforts to protect the state from climate impacts. Carol Moffett is president and CEO of the Center for International Environmental Law, a nonprofit organization that uses the power of law to protect the environment, promotes human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. And Reverend James Bhagwan is General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. Reverend James is a representative of the church and together with civil societies in the Pacific, advocates for climate change, West Papua, labor, mobility, and social justice. Wow, so welcome all of you. Really excited to be talking with you today. And Dallas, let's start with you. Indigenous sovereignty has been consistently undermined by fossil fuel development. IEN's been a core treaty partner since the early days. Can you talk about the work underway in North America and how you see that partnership evolving in the next couple of years of the campaign?
Yeah, can you hear me good?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Hamadak Bichante Washington Apido. My name is Dallas Goldtooth. I am with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and I live on Anishinaabe territories of so-called Chicago. So I'm really happy to be here and be a part of this program. You know, look, tribal nations, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines to take the full risk and danger of the climate crisis. You know, we have been carrying the brunt of capitalism since the initial exposure to colonialism, to European colonialism. And we continue to bear the brunt of capitalism to this day and its effects and how it has caused the climate crisis upon our communities, our ecosystems, and our local areas. Tribes have begun to pull together to address climate change in a multitude of ways these past few years, but more action is needed from the federal government to support tribal nations. And I'm talking specifically within the context of the United States. Furthermore, the US as a country has refused to recognize free, prior, and informed consent, which is something that the United Nations has adopted, many countries around the world, but it's not surprising that some of the countries that have the most engaged and politicized Indigenous base refuse to acknowledge FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. We need the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty because it recognizes not only the need to confront the dangers that fossil fuels presents to all life on this planet, but also recognizes the need to recognize, it also acknowledges self-determination of Indigenous peoples. It acknowledges the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous peoples to decide what happens to our territories, our lands, our waters, our bodies. Clear policies and processes requiring governments to consult with Indigenous nations and their peoples to obtain FPIC is absolutely essential in order for us to build a more equitable and healthy and sustainable future for all life on this planet. And as IEN, you know, our commitment to this endeavor, to this initiative, is to consult with tribal nations and Indigenous communities on why this initiative, why they should support and back this initiative and be get on board with it. With their input, we plan to help shape the campaign as well as inform the upcoming principles of the treaty as it's being fleshed out and developed. We're working with our sister organization, Indigenous Climate Action, one of the premier national organizations in Canada that works and supports and uplifts First Nations rights to protect their homelands and their climate and their ecosystems. And together, we really are looking to build out greater relationship with other Indigenous communities across the globe, starting within the Americas and then potentially building out from there. We really want to make sure that we are part of building power amongst Indigenous peoples collectively in this initiative. So I really look forward to this. I think this is historic. This is something that we haven't seen before. And just really excited that the Indigenous Environmental Network with our sister organization, Indigenous Climate Action, can be a part of this entire thing here. So that's my little spiel. That's what I got to share. Yeah, I really look forward to the next 2 years.
Thanks, Dallas. And I think the point that you made around creating the principles is really important. You know, a number of people have said to us, well, can I see a draft of the treaty? There isn't a draft yet of the treaty. And the reason for that is a lot of the...
Yeah.
It looks like someone, yeah, there we go. Someone needed to mute. A lot of the diplomats and lawyers that we talk to around the world have said, look, if you draft a treaty, countries will never adopt it. And the way that other treaties evolved is that civil society and then the first countries, the first willing countries, start to identify the principles under a treaty and the mechanisms of global governance that would be required under a treaty. And that's how it's built. And it has to be built in this cooperative framework. So in the next year, the treaty initiative working with IN, ICA, and also COICA, Indigenous nations across the Amazon, and others will be trying to identify what are those principles? How can we provide leadership and direction to governments to make sure that as we figure out how to stop expansion and wind down fossil fuel production, that is done in a fair and an equitable manner, and we're not recreating the systems that we're here to try and stop that threaten, you know, all of our lives. So super excited to be partnering with you and IEN on the development of those principles as we move forward. I want to bring now Bavreen into the conversation because I referenced at the end of there threatening all of our health. And while we know that fossil fuels are the greatest contributor to climate change, what we also know, especially from recent research, is that fossil fuels are not the greatest threat to human life. You know, 1 in 5 deaths worldwide are caused just by the air pollution from fossil fuels. So Bavreen, public health and the climate crisis are so intertwined. Last week, close to 200 health organizations called for a fossil fuel treaty, including the WHO. Can you talk about the importance of addressing fossil fuels from a health perspective and share your views on why the public health community is adding their focus to the energy transition and fossil fuel phase out conversation?
Yes, thank you, Zafora. And
just one sec, Bavreen, because I don't think anyone can see you. Can we highlight Bavreen and bring her forward? And Bavreen, I think you need your,
Is it on now? Is it there?
That's great. Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And now we have you. I can see you.
Okay,
great.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think there's something wrong here. So thank you so much for having voices as us as ordinary citizens. But I not only represent warrior moms, I represent probably every parent and the huge, wonderful groups of parents who've joined and who are working on the treaty because we really believe in it. And like you said, air pollution and public health are very closely related because I don't have to state the statistics like you just said. There's 1 out of 5 people who die because of the fossil fuels being burned. So it's probably affecting everyone, and whether it's politicians or it's the health workers, doctors, scientists, citizens as ourselves, we are all parents and we all care about our children. But then somehow it doesn't seem to really affect us that we are losing 7 million people in the world every year, or alone in my country, in India, we lost over 2.3 million people in 2019. So anyone who doesn't want to really think right there and want to save those lives is not well-meaning. And the treaty has, of course, brought us all together in this, because we see that, and how it's kind of a binding it's a binding strength among all of us people who were lost. We were all doing things individually and trying and saying the same things, and all these figures and statistics and studies, everything is there. But the treaty has kind of brought us all together, and we are all working towards. It's an aim, it's an objective that we've got. And you said, we were jumping the other day when the WHO endorsed the treaty, and you said that because it's a good feeling. We know that citizens as ourselves have no voice until the scientists and the doctors and health workers will come forward. So yeah, the public, the fact that the air pollution is a public health emergency, the source, the biggest source of pollution is the fossil fuels, is something that we know, and there is no questions about it, and there is no denial anymore. But the treaty helps to kind of get the best out of all the policymakers, and to kind of I would hate to say that, but to trap them into this whole strategy, and get them to actually act upon it, because saying is not helping. And like we just we were talking about many, there are just so many things that I'd like to actually, so the thing is, there's just too many things on my mind. And we know that basically all these abatement strategies are usually, they're political in nature, and targeting at them is it's something important. And we must realize that the key clean air strategies converge into abatement of climate change. And this is where we need to, I think, the fossil treaty and individuals like us play a role. And we know that energy consumption is very closely related to both air pollution and the greenhouse gases. Both the problems are primarily because of the combustion of fossil fuels. And so the policy options must be, they have to go far beyond what the health impact, whether they are studies or assessments, have derived those various facts. So from a climate change and air pollution perspective, this energy efficiency and a strong, decisive fossil fuel combustion society that we have formed, or a group that we have formed in the form of a fossil fuel treaty, is really a must. And I think that's been very, very critical, and it will show better and more results as in when we are all going to get stronger. And now the health professionals, the way they have raised their voices in this whole political discussion, and giving support for clean air policies at the various levels, has been heartening. And I think that's something we must all celebrate and take it forward, and in every way. And to me, Zipporah, one thing that we as all the parents and the parents of future various groups, we of course we all say that air pollution is a public health emergency, but we really are not treating it like one. Like even you asked me, but the various coming from a country and a city which is the most polluted in the world, we don't treat it like that. If we did, we would be curbing a lot of this rapid urban and economic development. And but it's not the same. We are not doing, I think most of the countries since COP26, we've all come back to the same levels of burning fossil fuels or even more. So whether we blame it on the war or whatever reasons. So we cannot deny that. And I wish I had more data to say, right now that we've gone back on those pledges. So if we know that this is a crisis, and it is a public health crisis, and it is costing my child 10 years of life in my city, and on an average global level, it's about 2 years life that you lose, your children will lose. I don't think there should be any reason for us not to be able to act on it, whether we are a politician or whether we are a health worker or a scientist. So this is my views and our views rather. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so well said, Bavrine. And it's just always astonishing to me whenever I dig into, some of the statistics on some of this work and the impacts on fossil fuels. The treaty group did this at Stockholm Plus 50. We looked at all of the sustainable development goals that the world has, and how does fossil fuel development impact each of their goals? There's a great report actually on our website on each of the sustainable goals. Maybe someone could put it in the chat there for people. And when I started digging into that data around health impacts and the impacts on our children of fossil fuels and air pollution, I think I came at these issues from a climate perspective and originally from a conservation perspective, because that's my background. And the health impacts just kind of, as a mom, also devastated me. So one of my great joys in this initiative and this work over the last 2 years is getting to learn so much more of other people's perspective, and then to join forces. Can I call myself a warrior mom now too, Bavrine, because we work together in getting
absolutely. Yes, that's exactly the point, that we're all moms and we're all parents, and we have to, we all have to jump in. And I mean that for every politician I meet and every leader. I say that to them. Yeah.
Well, and when you look at all of that data, the thing that always comes back to me, and every time I do a speech, people say, but I don't understand then, if renewables are cheaper, and if we know that fossil fuels are having all of these impacts on biodiversity, on climate change, on our children's health, on all of our health, etc., then why aren't we moving? And a lot of it comes back to, in our analysis, the power of the fossil fuel industry. Just last week, the OECD and the IEA released a report saying that subsidies to the oil and gas companies, these are the most profitable companies on the earth and have had the best year they've ever had in terms of profits. The fossil fuel subsidies have gone up 51% just in the last year. These companies are incredibly powerful. And so part of, I think, the power of the treaty initiative right now is by joining together with health groups around the world, like in India. The first health initiative for the treaty was last year in India, and groups representing 100,000 doctors and nurses endorsed the treaty in India. Or the cities initiative, we now have 69 cities, and one of the most recent is Calcutta in India, and one largest city in India endorsing the fossil fuel treaty. Then we start to show decision makers and our governments that and to hold power so that they are forced to start to address some of these issues. So really excited to be working with parents and warrior moms. I want to bring Senator. Yeah, thank you. For all your work. I want to bring Senator Rhodes into this conversation because we talked about cities. Hawaii is, of course, the first subnational to endorse the fossil fuel treaty. So earlier this year, you introduced a resolution calling for the state of Hawaii and all counties to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So why did you take this step? And what type of leadership are we seeing and needing from subnational governments in this climate fight?
Thanks. Can you hear okay?
We can, yeah.
Great. I think Hawaii, like a lot of places, but probably more so than most U.S. states, it's really obvious that the effects of climate change are already kicking in. Waikiki, which is our biggest tourist destination, the highest point in the whole little peninsula, is probably at the most 2 meters above sea level, and the low end is right at sea level already. So there's a general consensus. There's no argument about whether it's happening. You can see it happening. We're all terrified of hurricanes in Hawaii. We don't get them very often, but when we do, it's a big deal. And on the news, I just noticed last night, I was watching the local news, and our local news covers hurricanes pretty much in any part of the world. So we were looking at Fiona that, just hit Puerto Rico, but we cover it here because we care about that sort of thing. So there's a general consensus that, we need to do something, and we have been leaders in the topic, but and so that's the impetus for it. And politically, it's doable. We passed that reso with relatively little opposition. The part that's hard for us is the actual implementation. And we also just recently banned coal as a fuel, and that was fine. That bill went through easily as well. But then when we actually stopped using it about 3 weeks ago, the announcement was made that our electricity prices, which are already the highest in the US, are going to go up by 7% because the renewable projects that were supposed to fill in the gap didn't happen or aren't happening as fast because of the pandemic. That gets a little more difficult, but the political space is there, and it's driven by the fact that we can see it happening already. So, what kind of leadership do you need? I mean, I don't know. I mean, when the facts on the ground are that obvious, then it's easy. The harder sell, I think, is like the state that I grew up in, Indiana, where my father still lives, big coal producing state, at least traditionally it has been. It's not as obvious that there's a problem with global warming. And I think that's the harder sell politically, because you don't see the sea level rising. You don't have more frequent hurricanes, that sort of thing. So I don't know if that's a really satisfying answer, but of course, in a democracy, it all boils down to what you have, what kind of people get elected. And in my case, even though my views on global warming and what we need to do are well known, I've introduced a carbon tax bill several times that has passed the Senate once and passed the House once, but never both, unfortunately. And so there's the space for leadership to move forward, because there's not the political resistance you get from in other places.
Thank you first of all for all of your work. And I agree, there is, for some subnational, especially not major producers, there's more political space, and also for cities. And that's why when we studied other treaties, we saw that, for example, with nuclear non-proliferation, cities and states calling on their federal governments to start negotiating these treaties was part of what was essential in creating the momentum, because they're at a federal level, it's often much harder. The thing about states that are producing, though, that I think is also important to think about is the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is not saying we have to turn off the taps overnight. What we're saying is we have to stop expanding the problem. And I think that's also why it's really critical to have this momentum, so we can keep trying to get this message out, stopping expansion, and then managing the wind down so that no families are and workers are left behind. It's going to take time to figure out that wind down, and it's almost impossible to do if everyone's trying to do it on their own. But I really appreciate your work, and I certainly have noticed here at New York Climate Week that it is some of the states that we hear the strongest statements from, recognizing the situation that we're in. I mean, yesterday, Gavin Newsom at New York Climate Week was just absolutely on fire, just calling out decision makers and saying, enough already. We have to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel companies. We have to stop expanding it, because whole towns right now are being burnt to the ground in California. And so that's the reality we're facing. And I think those of you who are elected officials, who are grappling with both mitigation of climate change but also adaptation at the same time, know it better than anyone. I want to bring thank you. I want to bring Carol Moffett into this conversation. Carol, as I mentioned before, is an international lawyer and has been involved in developing the concept of the treaty from the very beginning. So Carol, like we've talked a lot about momentum behind the call for the treaty keeps growing, and it really amplifies the need to tackle fossil fuel production directly and on an international level. But it also means many more people are asking us, well, how do we get a treaty? What are the series of steps towards negotiating a formal treaty? What's the legal pathway to getting a treaty?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think just to reiterate something you said earlier, that pathway begins with the principles, and it begins with the political will. Treaties can take a wide array of forms, and they are at their heart simply legal documents. They are contracts, except instead of being among individuals, they are among states, and they are designed to create law, they create governance within the international community. And so the pathways to creating that law really depend on a few factors. Do we want to move quickly? What levels of ambition do we need? Are we looking for a universal instrument, or is it, or is the goal to first get first movers in place and have others come on board? I think that when we look at the steps towards negotiating the instrument, a lot really depends on those first fundamental questions. I think we're making progress in identifying the principles and also identifying some of the barriers that a treaty of this kind would need to address. As was raised earlier, even states, even governments that are willing and eager to look for means to stop expansion of fossil fuels face the risk that they may face investor-state dispute settlements, basically suits from private corporations who don't want them to take action to address the climate crisis. So it would seem that one obvious element of a treaty of this kind would be an explicit set of provisions to deal with that, to address the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms that are obstructing those states that are ready to take action from doing so. A treaty, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty needs to recognize the profound diversity of ways in which that proliferation of fossil fuels takes place, and it's very different from different states. It can be direct engagement in extraction, of course, but it can also be the financing that a state provides, the massive subsidies, often poorly disclosed subsidies. And so a good treaty will look at all of those elements and also look at how do we ensure a just transition? How do we balance the need to phase out fossil fuel production with the recognition that those countries that are most equipped to phase out fossil fuels should be moving first. In terms of, once we have those principles, or once we have a general sense of the scope of the agreement, then you bring a core group of states together to create a mandate to negotiate. That can be done within an international forum, such as the United Nations Environment Assembly, but you don't need that forum. All you really need is an agreement to enter negotiations by a small number of states who are ready to take action. And from there, you set timelines, you set terms of reference, and you make sure that, yes, absolutely, civil society has access to the space because they provide critical support and critical perspectives. And you address very, very clearly and very intentionally, what is the role in a space like that for the corporate actors whose very corporate livelihoods and long-term business plans depend on the treaty's failure. And so I'll leave it with that.
Okay, that was a lot and some things to unpack. I'm going to come back to you, especially because I know that you spoke at Carbon Tracker's launch with Global Energy Monitor and of course the United Nations of the Global Registry. I see we have some questions in the chat of how does the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production fit or help in this context. But first I want to bring our final panelist into the conversation, and then we'll go to some questions. Reverend Bhagwan, religious institutions have led the way on divesting from fossil fuels and playing a vital role in major climate mobilization. And today you're one of the growing group of faith leaders that's called for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. What compelled you to get involved, and what role can the faith community play in advocating for the end of the fossil fuel era?
It might help if I unmute.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Sephora. May I begin by greeting you in our traditional Fijian greeting, which is Mbula Vinaka, which translates as "May you have life in abundance." But despite the beautiful background, I'm actually speaking to you from Sweden, from the land of the Sami people, another group of indigenous people that continue to raise their voice and their concerns about the significance of fossil fuel, increasing fossil fuel production, and continue to join the call for a rapid reduction in fossil fuel investment and production. 18 years ago, our Pacific churches called for this very type of thing, for the end of fossil fuel industries around the world. It was 18 years ago in the island of Tarawa in Kiribati, where our church leaders saw firsthand, one of the earliest countries to start experiencing climate change and the impacts of climate change. And these are low-lying coral island atolls, which are at risk of completely disappearing. Just a few days ago, I was on the island of Norderney in Germany, where I saw the exact same thing happening. So this is not something that is happening only in the Pacific and only in small island developing states. It's happening everywhere around the world. And every country and every continent is experiencing these very dangerous extreme weather pattern phenomenons. So it's not just rising sea levels. It is that increased temperatures in summer. Europe has just had the hottest summer in 500 years. And it's only going to get worse. And, as we looked at what the churches said 18 years ago in the Pacific, almost 2 decades later, we continue to amplify that call that we need to end all new exploration and production of fossil fuel via a global moratorium and phase out of existing coal, oil, and gas production, and declining by at least 6% annually to meet this 1.5 degree target. And this is the problem, that there are already 425 fossil fuel bombs, and we use that term to explain the impact that these new fossil fuel projects have on our planet that will take us far beyond the 1.5 degrees. I'm very grateful to our fellow sisters and brothers in faith that have been quite early in engaging on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Fletcher Harper and the team at Green Faith, Reverend Henrik Grappe and the Church of Sweden team. And this year at the World Council of Churches General Assembly, was just concluded a few weeks ago, in their Living Planet Statement, which seeks a just and sustainable global community. One of the key things that was mentioned was that the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and other mechanisms like the proposal for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice by Vanuatu, movements for an international ecocide law. These are very important accountability mechanisms that need to come into place, because the conversations, unfortunately, at the UNFCCC continue to go on. We continue to hear more talk, as Greta, who is from Sweden, says more blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, our people are suffering. Our people are losing land. Our people are losing home. Our people are losing identity and livelihood. And they're at the risk of being the first major international migration and displacement as a result of climate change. And so we recognize that this non-proliferation treaty for fossil fuels. And as we've heard the processes being outlined, this is another way of ensuring and encouraging more businesses to divest, to shift their attention to alternative fuel energies. But I like what Dallas was saying earlier also, when he reflected from the Indigenous perspective, and particularly the issue around free, prior, and informed consent. Because one of the dangers that we are concerned about in the Pacific is that the switch from fossil fuel must, and you've also said this, the just transition, the equitable transition that needs to take place to ensure that we aren't going to shift to something else that is going to damage the environment. And we're terming it green and blue colonization in our region, because the idea that you can just go and pick very gently some nodes from the bottom of the ocean without impacting the ocean, which regulates this planet's life, is a fallacy. So it's very important that we see more faith communities stepping up. And as you've mentioned already, the Vatican coming on board is so significant. And more churches, more faith communities are coming up. And that has not only the moral weight behind it, but it calls on adherents of that faith to step up as well. So it's not just the churches and faith organizations that are going to divest. It's also calling leaders in business, leaders in government who profess to be people of faith to do what their faith communities are guiding them to do. That's calling them to make the appropriate decisions. And on a planet where 80% of the human population subscribe to some form of spiritual perspective, some form of religion, that is a powerful method for mobilizing the community. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you so much for all of your work. I'm wondering if I can ask Meredith, can we have all the panelists come back on the screen so we can have a conversation for the last 15 minutes? I have a number of questions for you all. Firstly, I actually just want to go back to this question of accountability, transparency, and this global registry. Carol, this week, the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production was launched. And I think in a lot of ways, I see it as the foundation of a really important foundation for this work. When I first started working on fossil fuel supply, I was so horrified to find out that we were on track to build 110% more fossil fuel projects than we could ever burn and stay below 1.5 degrees. And then also that there was really nowhere, no transparency on who was building what and where. So can you tell us a little bit about the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production that was just launched, and what the implications are, how we as different communities and activists can use this data, and why is this piece important? And maybe if someone could put from our team, from the fossil fuel team, could put the link to the Global Registry in the chat so people can see how to use it. Carol.
Thanks. And I'll say that, CL sees itself more as a user of the registry than as an architect. And so I'm commenting from that perspective. The registry, as you allude, is the first publicly accessible resource of its kind that actually puts data on fossil fuel reserves at the country level, at the project level, in a single place where it can be tracked over time, where it can be evaluated, where it can be studied. This is critically important because until now, people who wanted to access that data had to try and construct it for individual basins, individual countries on their own. Or if they wanted something more reliable, they had to rely on private for-profit entities like Rystad, who make this data available commercially, but at extraordinary cost and with not a lot of transparency. So the registry addresses those needs and starts to make data available at broad scale and to the wide public and to governments to demonstrate, here's what we know about reserves, who is adding reserves, who is declaring that they've removed reserves, and here is the climate impact of doing that. And as a lawyer looking at this, I think this means, this has tremendous potential with respect to holding both corporations and governments accountable. With respect to corporations, being able to track their declared reserves, what they're adding, allows us to compare what they're saying publicly about their commitments to confronting climate change, their commitments to action, and what they're actually doing on the ground, and highlighting where those gaps exist. When we look at it from the government perspective, it's really important to recognize that human rights treaty bodies, human rights mandate holders have over the last several years repeatedly raised questions about the compatibility of fossil fuel expansion with government's duties to respect, protect, and promote human rights. As we document how those reserves are growing at the country level, it provides another very powerful tool for human rights treaty bodies, for citizens, and for courts at both the domestic and the international level to look at government conduct and compare that government conduct to government's obligations to other nations and to their own citizens under international law and human rights law.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I just have played with instead of sleeping as you do, I spent some time playing with the global registry on the link, trying to see what was happening in the different countries last night. And it's fascinating to see the development in terms of carbon embedded in that development. I don't think we've ever really seen that before, and been able to say, this country is planning on taking up this much of the global carbon budget at this period of time. I think that's really important to kind of flip the norm around what is acceptable. I know in Canada, when I tried to talk to my own government about production and new oil drilling, the answer was, well, we're not really responsible for the production. We're only responsible for reducing emissions. And so we just keep dumping more and more of it into the marketplace. I think the registry is going to have a profound impact in shifting people's awareness to understanding that more drilling and more fracking, if you are doing that, you can't call yourself a climate leader. That is a political and a climate issue, how much carbon is embedded there. So in our final minutes, I want to kind of look forward to COP27. So we have the first conference of parties in Africa. We have and within a context of Putin's war on the Ukraine and the push now for even more fossil fuel by the fossil fuel industry, using the war and people's fear about prices as a reason to build out more, the push for more gas in Africa, yet at the same time unprecedented climate impacts. A 70-day heat wave in China, 33 million people displaced because of the floods in Pakistan. Thousands have lost their lives. People incinerated in their cars this summer in California. I think those images will never leave many of us. And so it feels to me like we are in this kind of pressure cooker in the run up to COP. And I'd love to get your perspective on what you think is a priority. Maybe I can start with you, Reverend. The Pacific Islands have played such an incredibly important role, and vulnerable nations play such an incredible important role in these climate conversations globally moving forward. What do you see? What should we be looking to? What do you see as priorities in the run up to COP?
Thank you. One of the key things, of course, will continue to be an acknowledged loss and damage day going on. That's going to be a key issue continuing for Pacific Island countries. And I mean, this is I often call loss and damage blood money, as the same as I do for anything when we start to address climate financing. But that's the reality. We have countries that are not willing to commit or not fully committing to climate financing, yet, as we've heard, are subsidizing to such a large extent fossil fuel companies. And this is some of the things that we continue to face as Pacific Island countries and other vulnerable countries end up having to take loans to pay for adaptation and mitigation, to pay for loss and damage, to pay for the relocation of communities and deal with disaster responses that are caused by extreme weather patterns. Yet the very people who then reach out to support us from the form of development and wanting to ensure that we go with their geopolitical bloc as opposed to another country's geopolitical bloc are the same people who are not stepping up to the issue of phasing out of fossil fuels. And, you know, we're really hoping that we move from the terms that were used in last year's COP from phase out being dropped to phase down to really being serious in this year's COP. And I think, even though we're in a time where there is a global energy crisis, we still need to think beyond the horizon. That's something for Pacific Islanders that's very important. When we sail on our canoes, we go out beyond the horizon. We cannot see the islands that are ahead, but we know what lies out there and we sail boldly towards it. And that's what we need. We need the bold commitments and the bold affirmations of the leaders to step up and make these commitments, to commit to the change that we need. We're running out of time. That's the reality. We have to act now. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. Dallas, let me go to you. You know, organizing in the run up to COP. You know, last year we all worked together to get decision makers to say the F word at COP. You know, it was a low bar, but we were just trying to get them to acknowledge that fossil fuels had to be constrained. And you know, we got some wishy-washy wording about unabated coal, et cetera, at COP26 in the Glasgow agreements. As IEN looks towards COP and this work with Fossil Fuel Treaty, what do you hope we're building towards, and what are you looking for at a COP?
Well, I mean, in all our work, you know, we are used to. I don't like to use antagonistic language, right? Like militaristic language, but we are definitely, in many regards, playing defense at the same time playing offense. You know, while we are fighting against the expansion of fossil fuels, we also are coming to the table with solutions, right? This conversation that we're having is how are we deconstructing the world that has decimated billions of lives across this planet, thousands upon thousands of cultures and languages, but also how are we building systems that are protecting those languages and cultures that are still here? How are we protecting and building systems that are generating a whole new future? And so last year at the COP and going to this year, we're definitely going to that space, trying to challenge the conversation around Article 6 and the implementation of Article 6, and really try to do our best to ensure that traditional ecological knowledge is respected on our terms. That it is Indigenous peoples who are dictating what that engagement looks like, but really to encourage nations to continue to say the F word, to say fossil fuels, to call it out, and to really draw the line to force nation states to make a decision on where they stand. And it is our task, those of us who have been doing this work on, I guess, non-state actors, right? Our job is to make those decision makers uncomfortable, to make decisions on our behalf, because oftentimes they sit in a place of comfort, and that place of comfort, again, is oftentimes to the detriment of many of our communities. And so we are really looking forward to this year at the COP this year in Egypt, to make sure we're uplifting frontline voices, impacted voices, forest and ocean dependent voices about what their knowledge means, but also what does a world look like without fossil fuels? So I think that's—
Thanks, Dallas.
All of it, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the network that we're building is more and more, now over 1,700 groups and associations join the treaty network is to make sure people see each other's work as well, and can support it. So if folks haven't already, of course, I'm going to ask you to please endorse the treaty as an organization or an individual at fossilfueltreaty.org. Sign up to our newsletter. It comes out once a month. And when in that newsletter, we tell you about the momentum happening around the world on fossil fuel treaty, but also highlight individual initiatives. And we try and do our best in our listservs and our email listservs and our newsletter in highlighting the work of partner organizations like IAN, so you can support their campaigns as well. A couple of really good questions in the chat. I want to try and get to them before we end. There's one from Nitya. One big issue we see in international climate discussions and treaties is accountability, and how those emitting the most CO2 are the ones that take least responsibility. So really getting at the equity question here. What are some of the treaty's long-term goals to tackle this issue and build goals to phase out fossil fuels based on each individual city, state, county's emissions and needs, especially with the fossil fuel registry as a new tool? Carol, would you want to take a first stab at that question around equity and differentiated responsibility and the treaty?
Yeah, and I'll say that this goes back to that point about principles, because I think you've touched on a critical principle in any just transition, and a critical principle for Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is that it has to have equity at its heart. And so I think that one of the principles that needs to define negotiations toward a treaty is, do we want it to be binding? I would say that yes, we do. Do we want it to have teeth so that countries that choose not to be a part of it face the consequences for that choice? I think the answer there again will ultimately be yes. And the flip side to that is, when you do that, when you make that choice to penalize those countries that are not participating in the system, that means that you can prioritize those countries that are, including countries in the global south who are going to have the greatest transition to make and need the most support in doing that. Part of the value of a treaty approach is that we can be intentional in how we undertake that transition, rather than simply leaving it to markets, which are often going to be driven by the massive production subsidies that OECD countries continue to provide.
Thank you. And our team has just posted into the chat a document that was prepared last year, the Civil Society Equity Review. And this is looking at what are the equity principles for production decline. And it is a huge area of research under the treaty initiative. So for those that don't know, the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is a research initiative, a political diplomacy initiative, and a campaign and communications initiative to grow the support for treaty around the world and support our partners around the world in their homes who are starting to create more public support and the difficult conversation about the need to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. So we actually have kind of a three prongs at the initiative, and we have a number of research initiatives that are going on with academics around the world trying to do things like this, like to put more content around how do we do this decline in an equitable way? Who gets to produce what and where if we have a limited carbon budget? Because right now, without the global governance mechanisms under a fossil fuel treaty, the market gets to decide who gets to produce and where. And as we all know, when the markets decides, there's not a lot of justice and equity taken into consideration there. Want to check with our panel. We've got 2 minutes left before we say goodbye to all of the folks online. Thank you. People from all over the world are joining today. I've seen people commenting from Poland, from Germany, from Argentina, from India, from all over the world. I thank you at the various odd hours that you're joining us. And for those who are going to watch this recording later, I just want to check with our panel who are doing so much of this amazing work on the ground, if there are any last burning comments on the eve of Climate Week on the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Maybe I'll start with you, Senator Rhodes.
Well, what comes to mind for me is just the economics of it. You know, economics, where I learned about negative externalities was economics 101 in college, which for those who aren't American and aren't used to the 101 is the most basic class. So instead of to offsetting the negative externalities that are quantifiable at this point, we're subsidizing the industries that are producing the negative externalities, which makes no economic sense, and I think is a powerful idea, a powerful tool for convincing policymakers that, hey, this is just contra to everything. If you're a pro-market person, we should not be subsidizing these emissions.
Absolutely. I think Gavin Newsom said yesterday, well, why do we keep giving money to the people who've created this problem? And there was kind of shocked. He said it in a forum that was kind of like I don't know, people don't really say those kind of things in that forum. There was kind of this shocked moment, and then everyone started applauding. It's really interesting. I totally agree with you. Bavreen, you haven't been in this conversation for a while. Is there anything that you'd like to share with us before we go?
Yeah, it was very, very, lovely, wonderful conversation. I'm so, enlightening and encouraging. And I just want to say something that I was, when we were talking about economics, and I was discussing that one time with Dr. Maria Naira, and she said to me that instead of always saying how many people are dying, say how many lives can be saved. I think that makes all the difference. It's when you connect health and air pollution, and you connect any kind of crisis, it's means more to people when you can say of how many lives can be saved rather than how many lives have gone. So I think that's what we can all kind of try to implement.
That is a
Thanks.
really beautiful thought, and I think we're after the hour. I'm going to have to end there. And I think a lot about that when I make decisions or when I'm talking to decision makers. Every ton of carbon we save from going into the atmosphere will save lives. And at this moment in history, often I get people saying to me, do you still have hope? Is it worth trying to do anything? Especially young people. And I'm a mom. My kids are in university now, and they know, wow, what does it matter? The world's on fire. It matters, because every action we take right now will save lives. And I think that's really important. And I was asked today in another interview, well, do you have any hope? And I want to leave people with the thought that hope isn't something you just have. It's something that we create. It's something that we create by our actions. And working with all of you and thousands of others around the world on this big, bold, audacious idea right now of a fossil fuel treaty is what is giving me hope. Thank you to all our panelists for taking the time to join us today and have this conversation, and for all of your work in the world. The recording will be posted to our website later this week if you'd like to revisit it. If you haven't already gotten involved in the treaty, please endorse the treaty as an individual or as an organization. Sign up, share it with your friends. You can find resources and campaign tools as well at campaign.fossilfueltreaty.org. And if you have the capacity, please donate to keep this work alive in the world. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.